In the 1995 classic film Heat,
cinematic titans Al Pacino and Robert De Niro come face to face for the first time, creating an unforgettable on-screen showdown. Their legendary encounter in this crime saga, set against the backdrop of Los Angeles, solidifies the film's place in cinematic history. A professional thief, Neil McCauley, prepares for a money heist. He dresses up as a paramedic, enters a nearby hospital, acts like their staff, and steals their ambulance. Meanwhile, Neil's associate Chris Shirless buys explosives, showing a fake driver's license, and pays in cash to avoid being traced. Neil and Chris, along with their crew members Trejo, Michael, and Waingro, plan to rob an armored van. They park their ambulance at the side while waiting for a signal from Trejo.
Soon, Trejo informs them about the location of the van,
and they all wear hockey masks. Waingro and Michael hit the van with their truck, while Neil and Chris block the exit path with an ambulance. When the cash van falls, the robbers set an alarm for 3 minutes to complete the heist. Soon, they get the envelopes from van, and Neil orders his group to leave. But Waingro kills a guard without being provoked, and they then kill the other 2 guards and leave. When the police arrive, Neil and his gang have already left and burned their clothes and masks in the ambulance. Later that day, Neil meets with his associate, Nate, who informs him that the envelopes they stole contain the bearer bonds worth millions of dollars. He adds that the bonds belong to a businessman, Vincent, who will buy these bonds from him at 60% price. Nate suggests to Neil about another robbery task by a man named Kelso, worth $10 million, and Neil agrees to do it. He asks Nate to set up the meeting with Vincent and leaves. When Officer Vincent reaches the robbery spot, he notices that the robbery was planned by professional thieves who ensured at least 2 exit paths. He further investigates the eyewitnesses and is informed about the word slick used by a man during a robbery. Vincent asks his team to run an identification search with the FBI about slick-named criminals, but gets no valuable information. Later, Neil meets with his gang at a restaurant and angrily hits Waingro for killing the guard. They then leave the restaurant, and at the parking lot, Neil starts beating up Waingro and tries to kill him. But they spot a police patrol car and get quiet. When they look back, Waingro has escaped. That night, Chris returns to his wife Charlene, and they fight because he is low on cash. She curses him for being a loser, and he angrily leaves. Chris then spends the night at Neil's place. Meanwhile, the home environment of Vincent is also tense as he keeps busy with work and doesn't spend much time with his wife and stepdaughter. Meanwhile, Neil feels lonely, so he goes to a bar and a gorgeous girl named Eddie approaches him, and they spend the night together. The next morning, Nate asks Neil to contact Vincent and collect his money, so Neil sets the meeting for the next day. Suddenly, Neil spots Charlene with another man at a cheap hotel, and he warns her to mend her relationship with Chris. Meanwhile, Vincent gets desperate when he can't find any clue about the recent robbery, so he threatens his informer Albert for information. Albert promises Vincent that his brother Richard will meet him later tonight with valuable information about the robbery. Later that night, Vincent reaches a bar at a given time and meets Richards, who informs him about a man named Michael acting suspiciously and being a real slick. Vince gets interested after hearing the word slick
and is informed that the man is called Michael.
So Vincent orders his staff to do 24-hour surveillance on Michael and whoever he meets up with. Unfortunately, Vincent deceives Neil and plans to kill his team, who goes for the collection of money in exchange for his bond. But Neil is already alert, and gunfire breaks from both sides, resulting in the death of men sent by Vincent. Neil then calls Vincent and threatens to kill him, which makes Vincent very scared, and he tightens his security. That night, Neil and his gang have a dinner party with their families at a restaurant when Neil notices they are all happy with their spouses and children. So, he feels left out and calls Eddie for a meetup, and they all leave. Meanwhile, Vincent and his colleagues watch Neil's group exiting the restaurant, and they mention that all of their houses are under surveillance. Waingro keeps a low profile for some days after his encounter with Neil, but one day he kills a young prostitute. It is revealed that Waingro is a serial killer who kills young prostitutes, and police have been looking for him. Waingro then meets with Van Zandt and decides to join him against Neil. On Thursday night, Neil and his gang try to rob the bank, which Kelso mentioned, and Neil decides to stay out during their heist. Neil is unaware of being watched by the police. Suddenly, a police officer makes a sound, and Neil gets alert and decides to walk off from the robbery. Vincent then gets frustrated as they can't arrest Neil and his gang for minor offenses such as breaking and entering the property. The next morning, Neil meets with his team and suspects they might be getting watched by police, so he advises them to forget about the next bank heist as the police are already after them. But they all want to do one last robbery together, so Neil lures the police into a big ground and takes pictures of the investigation team. At night, in a secret place, Neil meets with Nate with the pictures of the investigation team. Nate informs him about Vincent, that he is a workaholic and is taking special interest in Neil. Nate further states that police have cameras outside his team houses, but not on Neil, as they can't locate him. They discuss another heist plan, and Neil leaves, but Vincent finally gets his location and chases him. Vincent stops Neil and asks him for a cup of coffee, and Neil agrees. They both talk about themselves, and Vincent warns Neil to straighten his ways or the consequences will be severe. But Neil doesn't back down and warns Vincent that if he ever comes in Neil's way, he will not hesitate to kill him. Later, when Vincent gets back to the station, he is surprised to know that when he was with Neil, all surveillance cameras of the gang have been removed. He is further informed that Neil is also missing and wonders where the whole gang is. Meanwhile, Neil and his mates are sitting in a restaurant when suddenly Neil recognizes the grill man, Don Breeden.
When Trejo informs Neil
that he is being followed by police and can't accompany them for the heist, Neil decides to take Don Breeden as a getaway driver, and the crew carries out their heist. As the crew reaches the East National Bank, they carry out the heist peacefully without much resistance, but someone tips the police while the crew is on their way out. Vincent orders his team to let the crew in their car before shooting them, but Chris locates police aiming at them and starts gunfire. Hell breaks loose as the gunfire starts, killing and injuring several police officers. As they try to drive their car away, Neil fires at police cars to make their way, but unfortunately Don gets fatally shot. Vincent then aims at Neil and fires many gunshots, but luckily none of the bullets hit Neil. However, Chris gets shot on his shoulder during the crossfire, and Neil helps him towards a car. He takes Chris away from the police into an abandoned car and drives away. Meanwhile,
Michael, fighting police on the other side of the road,
gets trapped by police surrounding him and takes a little girl as a human shield to escape. But Vincent gets a clear shot of him and hits him in the head, saving the little girl.
Neil takes Chris to a doctor,
who treats his wounds immediately and states that Chris will be stable in a couple of hours. Neil asks the doctor to take care of Chris, while he states that Nate will come and pick him up.
Neil suspects Trejo betrayed them
and tipped the police about them, so he goes to his house for revenge.
But he comes across Trejo on the floor,
beaten and bleeding profusely, who confesses that Waingro forced him to tell about the bank robbery plan. He further states that Waingro killed his wife, and he now works for Van Zandt. Neil then goes to Van Zandt's mansion and notices him watching TV, sitting comfortably. Neil suddenly throws a chair at the window and breaks in. He asks Van Zandt about the location of Waingro, but Van Zandt doesn't reply, so Neil shoots him multiple times. Nate gives Neil the address of the hotel where Waingro is staying, and Neil asks Nate to make another travel plan as he doesn't trust his old plan now. Meanwhile, police locate Van Zandt's guard, who tipped them about Neil, and he states that Waingro helped them. Vincent then traces Waingro's address and puts the police squad outside his room as they realize that Neil will come for Waingro. Neil goes to his apartment, where Eddie has seen the news. She runs away after seeing him, but Neil convinces her to stay with him. He asks her to go to New Zealand with him so that they can start a new life, and she agrees. Neil takes her to Nate, collects their fake passports and travel documents, and is informed that Chris has left to look for Charlene. Unfortunately, the police threaten Charlene that if she doesn't call Chris, they will put her in jail. So she calls him, but when he arrives, she warns him about the police, and he escapes safely. While Neil is on his way to the airport, he gets a call from Nate about the location of Wainwright being at a hotel near the airport. So, Neil asks Eddie to stay in the car while he comes back in a few minutes. Neil reaches the hotel unnoticed, dresses up as their staff, and cleverly gets information about Wainwright's room number. He then starts a fire alarm. Neil reaches outside Wainwright's room and asks him to exit the room due to a fire emergency. Just as Wainwright opens the lock, Neil kills him with multiple shots. When Vincent is informed about the recent havoc, he is at the hospital consoling his wife as their daughter tried to commit suicide, but his wife understands his work and lets him leave. As Vincent reaches outside the hotel, he notices Eddie waiting for Neil, and when Neil is about to reach his car, he spots Vincent and runs away, abandoning Eddie. Neil runs towards the airport, and Vincent pursues him. They exchange brief gunfire before Neil hides behind the airport electronic control shacks near the runway. Neil realizes that the bright lights from the runway might blind Vincent and help him to shoot Vincent. So, he gets out of hiding and aims at Vincent. Suddenly, Vincent notices Neil's shadow and fires at him multiple times. Neil falls down as Vincent approaches him. He holds Neil's hand as he dies peacefully. Heat, released in 1995, directed by Michael Mann, produced on a budget of approximately $60 million. While Heat is widely known for being the first film where De Niro and Pacino share screen time, they both previously appeared in The Godfather Part 2, but never shared a scene together. The iconic coffee shop scene between Al Pacino and Robert De Niro was shot with no rehearsal to capture the raw intensity between the two actors. The shootout scene after the bank heist is often regarded as one of the most realistic gun battles in film history, particularly for its portrayal of sound in an urban environment. It's used in military and law enforcement training for its depiction of proper urban combat tactics. Heat remains a touchstone in the crime genre, particularly for its detailed portrayal of both sides of the law and the performances of its lead actors. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. Turn on the notifications and leave a like to help the channel out.